My cheating wife exposed and lover sent to prison. My true revenge story. Have you ever thought that after years of being with someone, you knew them completely? Well, that's what John thought after being married to his wife, Sarah, for over 20 years. Their relationship had its ups and downs, like any marriage. But what John didn't realize was that the love of his life was slipping away quietly, without him noticing the cracks forming beneath the surface. For 2 decades, John and Sarah shared everything: love, laughter, a home, and 2 children. From the outside, their marriage seemed stable, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Sarah had grown distant. She no longer seemed interested in their conversations, avoided intimacy, and often seemed lost in thought. But like many people, John brushed it off as a phase, a busy period of life that they would push through. Little did he know, this phase would shatter his world in ways he could never have imagined. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Sarah, with a coldness in her voice, dropped a bombshell. "John, I want a divorce." The words hit him like a train. John was speechless, his mind racing to understand how things had gotten to this point. He hadn't seen it coming, and he couldn't comprehend what she was saying. When he managed to gather his thoughts, he asked her the inevitable question: why? Her response would leave him devastated. She admitted she had been seeing someone else, a wealthy businessman named Robert. John's heart sank as Sarah explained that she had fallen out of love with him and found excitement elsewhere. 20 years, gone in the blink of an eye. John was left feeling empty, betrayed, and humiliated. But what started as a story of heartbreak and betrayal would soon take a much darker turn, as John's quest for answers led him to uncover secrets more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about uncovering a web of deceit, threats, and criminal activity. And John wasn't about to back down. Discovering the betrayal. John's world was spinning. For days after Sarah's confession, he couldn't think straight. How could everything fall apart so quickly? How had he missed all the signs? The questions haunted him, and the pain of knowing she had been with someone else was almost too much to bear. He spent those first few nights alone in their house, pacing the empty rooms, trying to make sense of it all. Each memory of their life together now felt tainted. Their wedding day, the birth of their children, the simple joys they had shared. Every moment seemed overshadowed by Sarah's betrayal. But as the initial shock started to fade, John's emotions shifted. The confusion and sadness slowly began to give way to something else: anger. How could she throw away everything they had built? And for who? Who was this Robert? What did he have that John didn't? John needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them sitting at home, lost in his thoughts. So he started digging. It wasn't hard to find out more about Robert. He was a well-known businessman in town, someone who made a name for himself with his wealth and charm. People respected him, or at least they pretended to. But the more John learned, the more unsettled he became. There was something about Robert that didn't sit right with him. He'd heard rumors, whispers about Robert's shady business deals and how he treated people who crossed him. John wasn't sure if the stories were true, but he knew one thing for certain: this man had wrecked his life, and he wasn't about to let him get away with it. John confronted Sarah again, desperate for more information. He wanted to know how long this affair had been going on, how deep it ran. The anger in him was boiling over, but Sarah remained cold and distant, as if she had already moved on. She wouldn't give him any details, only repeating that she had fallen in love with Robert and that she didn't feel the same way about John anymore. That was the moment when something shifted inside of John. He realized he wasn't just fighting for answers anymore. He was fighting for justice. He couldn't stop thinking about Robert and what kind of man would knowingly destroy another family. And so, John's journey took a new turn. He wasn't going to sit back and accept defeat. If Robert had a dark side, John was going to find it. Uncovering the affair partner. John had made up his mind. He wasn't just going to let this go. He needed to know more about Robert, this man who had come into his life and ripped everything apart. John wasn't a private investigator, but desperation makes people do things they never thought they would. So he started digging. The first thing John did was gather all the information he could find online. Robert's name was easy to search. After all, he was a prominent businessman in their town. His face appeared on multiple business websites, charity events, and even in the local newspaper. From what John could see, Robert lived a life of luxury. He had the cars, the expensive suits, the big house in the wealthy part of town. On the surface, Robert appeared to be everything that John wasn't, at least financially. But as John went deeper, something began to feel off. People didn't talk about Robert the way they would talk about a well-respected businessman. Instead, there were rumors, whispers. John found old forum posts and anonymous blogs hinting at shady business deals. There were vague mentions of people who had worked with Robert and later regretted it, talking about being cheated or bullied into bad deals. But none of this was concrete, and it frustrated John to no end. The more he learned, the more unsettled he became. There was one story that stood out, a post by someone who claimed to have worked directly for Robert. They wrote about how Robert had gotten involved in illegal deals, things like money laundering and even threatening people who didn't go along with his schemes. But once again, there was no proof, just someone's word on an anonymous post. John's heart raced. If any of this was true, then Robert wasn't just a man who had stolen his wife. He was dangerous. The problem was, John didn't have any way of confirming these rumors. For all he knew, it could just be angry former employees spreading lies. But something inside him told him that this wasn't just gossip. Robert had power, and people feared him. That much was clear. John tried asking around. He contacted a few people who had worked with Robert, pretending to be interested in business dealings, but most of them didn't want to talk. Those who did kept it brief, often warning him to stay away from Robert. The message was the same every time. He's not someone you want to mess with. But John was beyond warnings now. His anger was burning too hot, and his need for answers was too strong. He had already lost so much. How could he just walk away? Then, one evening, as John was sitting at a local cafe, staring blankly at his phone, he noticed something strange. A man sitting at the table across from him had been watching him for a while, but as soon as John made eye contact, the man quickly looked away. It was subtle, but enough to make John suspicious. The next day, it happened again. Different man, same behavior. That's when John realized Robert knew. He knew John was digging around in his life. The realization hit John hard. Robert wasn't just going to sit by and let him snoop around. He was being watched. This was no longer just a personal issue about his broken marriage. This was becoming something darker, something dangerous. John was no longer just a man trying to piece his life back together. He was a man in the middle of something much bigger. And whatever Robert was hiding, it was clear that he didn't want anyone to find out. Confrontation and threats. John's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the eyes on him wherever he went. It wasn't just paranoia. He knew he was being watched. It wasn't just the man in the cafe. He'd noticed others too. A car parked outside his house that wasn't usually there. People lingering nearby who seemed out of place. John had stirred up something, and Robert was sending a message. Back off. But John wasn't the kind of man to scare easily, especially not now. He had already lost his marriage, his sense of security, and the life he thought he had. He wasn't about to give up on the truth. So instead of retreating, John decided to push forward. The next few days were tense. John made sure to watch his back, always looking over his shoulder. But he didn't stop his investigation. He kept searching for more information about Robert, contacting anyone he could think of who might know something. Most people were too afraid to talk. Some simply ignored him. But eventually, he found a former business associate of Robert's who was willing to meet him in secret. They met in a dimly lit bar on the edge of town, far from where anyone would recognize them. The man was nervous, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes as if he expected someone to walk in at any moment. His voice was low as he spoke, barely more than a whisper. "You need to stop this, John," the man warned. "Robert's not just some rich guy who cheated with your wife. He's connected to people you don't want to mess with. I'm talking serious criminals, guys who'll make you disappear if you keep digging." John leaned in, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I don't care who he's connected to. This isn't just about my marriage anymore. This man has ruined my life, and he's going to pay for it." The man shook his head, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I get it. I know what he's done to you. But trust me, he's not someone you can take down. He's too powerful. You've already got his guys watching you. They've warned you once. Next time, it'll be worse." But John wasn't about to back down. He was more determined than ever. Robert might have power, but John had something Robert didn't. He had the truth on his side. And he wasn't going to let fear stop him from exposing whatever it was that Robert was hiding. Days went by, and the tension only grew. John was careful. He tried to stay out of sight as much as possible. But no matter where he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Every car that drove by, every stranger who glanced in his direction, it all felt like a threat. He knew that if he wasn't careful, things could turn violent. Then one night, everything changed. John had just pulled into his driveway after a long day of trying to track down more leads. The street was quiet, the only sound being the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed a figure standing in the shadows near his front door. At first, He thought it might just be his imagination. But as he got closer, the figure stepped forward, revealing a man dressed in all black. John's heart skipped a beat. Before he could react, the man spoke, his voice cold and threatening. "This is your final warning. Walk away, John. Stop digging, or you won't live to regret it." John stood frozen, the weight of the threat sinking in. This wasn't just about his broken marriage anymore. This was life or death. But as scared as he was, something inside him refused to back down. "Tell Robert I'm not afraid," John replied, his voice steady despite the fear swirling inside him. "I'm going to find out the truth, and when I do, it's over for him." The man didn't say another word. He just stared at John for a moment, his eyes cold and hard, before turning and disappearing into the night. John stood there for a long time after he was gone, trying to process what had just happened. He knew now that Robert wasn't playing games. This was serious. But instead of retreating, the encounter only fueled John's determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for justice, for his family, for everyone Robert had ever hurt. And no matter what, he wasn't going to stop until the truth came out. Revenge plot. John knew he had crossed a line. The threat from Robert's men had made it clear that this wasn't just a game anymore. But instead of scaring him off, it only pushed him further. He wasn't going to live in fear. And he definitely wasn't going to let Robert get away with everything he had done, not just to him, but to others. John's first move was to gather all the information he could on Robert's shady business dealings. He had already heard enough whispers to know that Robert wasn't the upstanding businessman he pretended to be. But rumors weren't enough. John needed hard evidence. So he went back through all the old blog posts and forum threads, digging deeper into the anonymous claims about Robert. Slowly, a pattern started to emerge. It wasn't just one or two people who had bad things to say about him. There were several, and they all described the same thing: Robert making illegal deals, manipulating people into signing contracts that left them with nothing, and using his money to make problems disappear. John knew he was onto something big. But it wasn't enough to bring Robert down. John needed proof, something that would make the authorities listen. He started contacting some of the people who had left those anonymous posts, hoping that someone would be willing to talk. Most didn't respond, and those who did told him the same thing: stay away from Robert. He's dangerous. But John wasn't giving up. Finally, he found someone, a former employee of one of Robert's companies, who agreed to meet with him in person. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place where they were unlikely to be seen. The man was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, but he was tired of living in fear. He told John everything he knew: how Robert had been laundering money through his businesses, bribing officials to cover it up, and using threats to keep people silent. John took notes carefully, making sure to document every detail. This was the kind of evidence he needed, but it still wasn't enough. He needed something concrete, something that could tie Robert directly to the illegal activities. That's when John got the idea to follow the money. If Robert was laundering money, there had to be a trail. John started looking into Robert's financial records, digging through public filings and company documents. It took time, but eventually, he found what he was looking for: discrepancies in the numbers, shell companies that didn't seem to serve any real purpose, and large sums of money moving in and out of accounts with no clear explanation. John couldn't believe what he had uncovered. It was bigger than he had imagined. Robert wasn't just a cheater. He was a criminal running an empire built on lies and corruption. And now, John had the proof. But he knew that going to the authorities wouldn't be enough. Robert had connections, and there was no guarantee that the police or even the local government would take action. He needed to make sure this didn't get swept under the rug. So, John reached out to a friend of his, a journalist who had always been interested in exposing corruption. He knew that if this story went public, Robert wouldn't be able to hide behind his money and power anymore. The journalist agreed to help, and together, they started preparing the evidence for an expose. But John also knew this was dangerous. Robert's men had already warned him once, and they weren't likely to give him another chance. So he made sure to stay careful, avoiding any patterns in his daily routine and keeping his movements as unpredictable as possible. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. As they worked on putting the story together, John found himself thinking about everything that had led him here. He had started this journey out of heartbreak, trying to understand why his wife had betrayed him. But now, it wasn't about Sarah anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about justice. Robert had ruined too many lives, and John wasn't going to let him keep doing it. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all the people Robert had hurt over the years. and he was going to make sure Robert paid for every single one of them. Finally, after weeks of work, they were ready. The evidence was solid, the story was written, and the journalist was prepared to publish it. John knew that once the article went live, everything would change. Robert would be exposed for the criminal he was, and there would be no going back. But before they could release the story, John made one last move. He went to the authorities. Armed with the evidence he had gathered and the backing of a journalist who was ready to go public, John presented his case to the police. This time, they couldn't ignore him. They launched an official investigation, and soon, the walls around Robert's empire started to crumble. Robert had no idea what was coming. He had spent years building a life of power and control, but now it was all falling apart. And John, once the man who had lost everything, was the one pulling the strings. John didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't the same person who had sat in his living room all those months ago, shattered by the news of his wife's affair. He was stronger now, driven by something bigger than himself. And he wasn't going to stop until Robert was held accountable for everything he had done. Legal consequences for Robert. The day John had been waiting for finally came. After weeks of gathering evidence and working with his journalist friend, the authorities took notice. They had no choice. What John had uncovered was too big to ignore. Robert, the man who had seemed untouchable, was now under investigation. At first, things moved slowly. The police didn't rush in with flashing lights and handcuffs. They started quietly, looking into the financial records John had brought to them, verifying the details and digging into Robert's business deals. It was a slow process, and for a while, John feared that nothing would come of it. He worried that Robert's connections and influence would be enough to make the whole thing disappear, just like all the other times before. But this time was different. The evidence was too strong, too well documented. There were too many witnesses willing to talk now that they knew they weren't alone. John's efforts had built momentum, and slowly but surely, the walls around Robert began to crumble. It started with small steps. First, Robert's companies were placed under investigation for tax fraud and money laundering. Authorities froze several of his accounts, and Robert's lawyers scrambled to control the damage. But it wasn't long before things escalated. News of the investigation leaked to the press, and suddenly, Robert's name was all over the headlines. His pristine public image was shattered, and there was no way to hide it anymore. John watched it all unfold from a distance, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him felt satisfied. This was the man who had destroyed his marriage and hurt so many people. Seeing him finally face the consequences was a long-awaited moment of justice. But another part of him couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about bringing a dangerous man to justice. As the investigation deepened, more and more people came forward with stories about Robert. Former employees, business partners, even people from the same social circles. They all had something to say about the way Robert had manipulated, cheated, and threatened them. And with each new testimony, the case against Robert grew stronger. Then, one morning, the news John had been hoping for broke. Robert had been arrested. It didn't happen in some dramatic raid. No, it was far more understated. The authorities showed up at Robert's office with a warrant, and they took him into custody without a fuss. But the impact was immediate. Robert's arrest sent shockwaves through the business world. His empire, once thought to be invincible, was now crumbling before everyone's eyes. For John, it was a moment of quiet victory. He didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no triumphant feelings. Instead, there was a sense of closure, a quiet understanding that this chapter of his life was finally coming to an end. But the story didn't stop there. The legal process took time, and Robert's lawyers fought tooth and nail to defend him. They tried everything, questioning the credibility of the witnesses, attacking the validity of the evidence, even trying to paint Robert as the victim. But the truth was undeniable. The documents John had gathered, the testimonies from those Robert had hurt, and the financial trail of corruption were all too clear. The trial became a public spectacle. People were glued to the news, following every update, every twist and turn. And through it all, John watched, feeling a strange sense of distance from it all. He had set this in motion, but now, it was bigger than him. It wasn't just about his personal vendetta anymore. It was about justice. Justice for everyone Robert had wronged. In the end, Robert was found guilty on multiple charges: fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to several years in prison, his empire dismantled, and his reputation ruined. The man who had once been on top of the world now sat in a jail cell, a symbol of greed and corruption brought down by the truth. For John, It wasn't a moment of celebration. It wasn't about revenge or satisfaction. It was about something deeper, closure. He hadn't just won, he had found peace. The man who had once destroyed his life was no longer a threat. Robert was behind bars, and his power was gone. But perhaps more importantly, John had found a new sense of purpose in the process. He had fought for the truth, for justice, and for the people Robert had hurt. And in doing so, he had discovered a strength within himself that he never knew existed. He had started this journey feeling broken and betrayed, but now he stood taller, knowing that he had done what was right. As the dust settled, John took a deep breath, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There was still healing to do, both for himself and for his family. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The storm was over, and the future, though uncertain, was finally something he could look forward to. Reconciliation with Sarah. With Robert behind bars and his empire crumbled, John felt like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. But the victory, while satisfying, left him with an empty space that he wasn't sure how to fill. His life had been consumed by uncovering the truth, by seeking justice, and now that it was done, he had to face what had been broken much closer to home, his relationship with Sarah. For months, they had barely spoken outside of the divorce process. Sarah had moved out of their home and stayed with family while the dust settled. There had been no dramatic fights, no harsh words after the initial shock, but there was a wall between them, cold and silent. John didn't know if it could ever be torn down, but deep down, neither of them wanted to give up completely. They had 2 children together, years of memories, and at one point, they had shared a deep love. Despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayal, there was still something worth fighting for, at least for the sake of their family. One evening, after the legal battles with Robert had come to an end, Sarah reached out. Her message was simple: "Can we talk?" John didn't know what to expect, but he agreed. They decided to meet at a small park, a place they used to take their kids when they were younger. It was neutral ground, away from the house filled with memories and the tension that still lingered between them. When they finally sat down on a bench, the silence between them was heavy. Neither of them knew where to begin. John could see the regret in Sarah's eyes, but he also knew that they couldn't undo the past. No amount of apologies could erase what had happened. So instead of starting with blame, they started with honesty. "I'm sorry, John," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I never meant to hurt you. I got lost in something I thought I wanted, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." John had waited months to hear those words, but now that they were here, they didn't feel as satisfying as he had imagined. Instead, they left him feeling raw, exposed. He wasn't angry anymore. He was just tired. Tired of the pain, tired of the betrayal, tired of living in the past. "I don't know what to say, Sarah," John replied softly. "You hurt me in ways I never thought possible. I trusted you with everything, and you walked away. I'm not sure how to move forward from that." Sarah nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me, at least not yet. I just want to find a way to rebuild what we lost. I know it's going to take time, but I want to try for us and for the kids." John wasn't sure if reconciliation was possible. Could they ever truly rebuild what had been shattered? But as he looked at Sarah, he realized that she wasn't the same person who had walked out on him. She was remorseful, broken in her own way, and trying to find a path forward just like he was. And while it wouldn't be easy, the thought of healing, of finding some kind of peace, seemed worth pursuing. They talked for hours that evening, not just about the affair, but about everything that had gone wrong in their marriage. They talked about the distance that had crept in over the years, the unspoken resentment, the pressures of life that neither of them had fully acknowledged until it was too late. It wasn't an easy conversation, and there were moments when it felt too painful to continue. But for the first time in a long time, they were truly talking, honestly, without walls or defenses. The road to reconciliation wasn't going to be simple. They both knew that. Trust had been broken, and it wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. But they agreed to take it one step at a time. John knew he wasn't ready to forgive her completely, and Sarah knew she couldn't expect things to go back to the way they were. But they both wanted to try. Their children, who had been caught in the middle of everything, needed healing too. The family had been torn apart by the affair and the fallout, and it was going to take time to bring them back together. But for the sake of their kids, for the sake of the life they had built together, John and Sarah were willing to put in the work. They started seeing a therapist, working through their issues slowly. There were setbacks, moments of doubt where John wondered if they were making the right decision. But each time, they came back to the same conclusion. If there was a chance, even the smallest one, to rebuild their family, It was worth the effort. As the months passed, the anger and bitterness started to fade, replaced by a cautious hope. John still had moments where the pain of the betrayal would hit him unexpectedly, but they were fewer and farther between. And Sarah, for her part, was patient, willing to do whatever it took to make things right. Reconciliation wasn't a destination, it was a process. And for John and Sarah, that process was still ongoing. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was light at the end of the tunnel. The love they had once shared wasn't gone. It had just been buried under years of hurt and mistakes. And now, slowly, they were starting to uncover it again. The journey ahead was long, but they were walking it together. And for John, that was enough. Conclusion. John's life had taken so many unexpected turns. What started as the worst time of his life, discovering his wife's betrayal, losing the sense of security he had built for over 20 years, had transformed into something completely different. It wasn't just about pain or revenge anymore. It was about rebuilding, finding justice, and most importantly, rediscovering himself. Looking back, John realized that the journey had changed him in ways he never expected. He had gone from a man who was broken and betrayed to someone who had stood up for himself and others. The fight against Robert wasn't just about exposing a corrupt businessman. It was about standing up for truth, for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. But now, as he focused on healing his relationship with Sarah and rebuilding his family, John understood that the hardest battles aren't always fought in courtrooms or against enemies. Sometimes the toughest fights happen within, as we try to forgive, to move on, and to let go of the past. Reconciliation with Sarah was a long process, and there were no guarantees. John knew that, but they were both committed to trying, not just for the sake of their children, but because deep down, they both believed in the possibility of a second chance. Maybe they wouldn't be the same couple they once were, but they were learning to be honest with each other in ways they hadn't before. And that was something worth fighting for. For John, the biggest takeaway wasn't just that he had taken down a powerful, corrupt man. It was that he had found a new sense of strength in himself, a strength he never knew he had. Life hadn't gone the way he planned, but he was walking a path he never thought he'd be on, and that journey had shown him how resilient he truly was. As the story of Robert's downfall made its way through the media, John was approached by many people. Some were victims of Robert's schemes. Others were just people who had followed the story and felt inspired by his fight for justice. But for John, the most important people were those closest to him, his children, his family, and Sarah. They were the reason he fought so hard, not just for revenge, but for a better future. In the end, John's story wasn't just about exposing a criminal or getting revenge on a cheating wife. It was about finding closure, rediscovering hope, and realizing that even in the darkest of times, there's always a chance to rebuild if you're willing to fight for it. As John moved forward, he knew that life would still have its challenges. But now, he faced those challenges with a new perspective. He had learned that pain doesn't define you. How you respond to it does. And sometimes the hardest moments in life can lead to the most profound transformations. For anyone out there going through something similar, whether it's betrayal, loss, or a fight for justice, John's story is a reminder that no matter how broken things may seem, there's always hope. It might not be easy, and the road might be long, but with strength and determination, you can find your way to a better place. So, if you found strength in John's story, remember this: you're not alone in your fight. Whether it's against an injustice or within your own relationships, there's always a way forward. You just have to be brave enough to take that first step.